Beneath the ruins of fallen empires and the silence of censored archives, some stories claw their way back to light. This is one of them, a tale buried by ash, rewritten by fear, and whispered only by the walls of forgotten tunnels. If you listen closely, you'll hear it, a name erased, a plan betrayed, a bell that rang when no one dared speak. Step inside, but know, once heard, it cannot be unheard. In the snow-laden alleys of Warsaw's old quarter, the whispers of war had turned into screams by the winter of 1943. The once bustling Jewish neighborhoods were now reduced to hollow, cracked bricks and silent windows with eyes long shut. Behind one of these shattered facades, in a soot-blackened apartment above a bakery that no longer baked, lived a 14-year-old girl named Anila Sobieska. She was small, wiry, with eyes far too knowing for her age. She was also, unknown to all but the floorboards beneath her bed, a chronicler of horrors. Anila wrote with a borrowed pencil on the backs of propaganda leaflets, on torn school pages, on anything she could find. Her letters, as she called them, were never meant to be sent. They were addressed to no one in particular, sometimes to the world, other times to God, and often just to whoever finds this. They began as childish accounts of hunger and fear, but evolved into a startling, poetic witness of life inside the Warsaw Ghetto. Her father, Jakub, a once proud bookseller, had been taken during the Suka Avenue raids. Her mother, Magda, worked in the rag-sorting warehouse on Nowolipki Street, walking there each dawn past German guards who looked at her as though she were already dead. Anila would watch from the window, clutching a small notebook wrapped in a black ribbon, her truth book, she called it. In one letter, dated February 12, 1943, Anila wrote, "They have eyes like crows, Mama says. Crows that circle above but never touch the ground. She says the ones who wear leather coats and ask for papers are the worst. I don't want to become paper. I want to stay Anila." She described the children's games in the courtyard, games played with invisible balls, songs whispered instead of sung, rules made to avoid being seen. The ghetto walls loomed above them, not just in stone but in silence. Smuggling was a game too, but with stakes that ended in bullet holes. Anila's friend Pyotr had vanished after sneaking bread through a drainage pipe. "He is a ghost now," she wrote, "but not the sad kind. He is the kind that watches from rooftops and makes sure we laugh sometimes." In March, after a roundup emptied 2 more buildings on her street, Anila stopped writing for a week. The silence in her pages mirrors the silence of the ghetto, dense, unrelenting. When she resumed, her words came in bursts, urgent and fractured. "We found shoes. No feet in them. Just shoes. Mama says don't touch them. But I did. I said sorry." Her most poignant entry came just days before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising began. She had overheard men speaking near the basement, men with pistols, one of whom wore the tattered remnants of a Polish officer's coat. She wrote, "They said we will not die like sheep. That sheep forget their names. That if they shoot, we shoot back. Even with broken guns," they said. "Even with bricks. I wanted to ask if children can throw bricks too." The letters grew darker, not in tone but in ink. Anila had begun using burned match tips and berry juice. She hid each note under loose floorboards beneath her cot. Her mother never asked what she was writing, though she surely knew. It was the kind of unspoken truth that bound the women of the ghetto: survive, but never forget. April brought fire. Anila described waking to the sound of screaming steel. The uprising had begun. She didn't know its name, only that the night sky pulsed orange and that her mother prayed aloud for the first time in years. "The men are fire," she wrote. "They run like fire, they scream like fire. And when they fall, the earth doesn't take them. It holds them up so the others will see." Days passed. Food ran out. The bakery below was struck by a shell, its chimney toppled like a drunk giant. Magda was hit with shrapnel while foraging for water. Anila spent the night pressing cloth against her mother's side, humming lullabies she barely remembered. Her final entry, smeared with blood and tears, read simply, "I'm still here." She was not. In 1987, during post-war renovations of a now-abandoned apartment building in the Murmansk district, construction workers discovered a hollow beneath the floorboards. Inside were 17 letters, tightly rolled and wrapped with a black ribbon that had faded to gray. The pages were brittle, some barely legible, but the handwriting was unmistakably that of a child. The last page bore a smudged fingerprint and a date, April 27, 1943. Anila's story, once silent, became known through the whispered translation of historians and the passionate work of archivists. Her words were later displayed in Warsaw's Museum of the History of Polish Jews, her letters preserved in glass cases under soft lighting. People wept as they read the letters. Teachers brought students. Survivors left stones on the display, a Jewish sign of remembrance. No photograph of Anila was ever found. Her face remains unknown, but her voice, her words, lived longer than the walls that tried to cage them. She never fired a shot or led a march, but in the quiet bravery of a pencil to paper, Anila Sobieska became a witness to the end of a world, and the fragile hope that someone, someday, would listen. The Arctic Sea is a graveyard without markers. Beneath its black waters lie ships no one speaks of and men no one remembers. In the frozen theater of World War II's lesser-known fronts, few operations were as punishing, or as mysterious, as the Allied Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union. Among them was Convoy Vega, a mission so drenched in secrecy and so riddled with disappearance that even today, it is known only in the scattered whispers of naval lore. In March 1942, Commander Alastair Finch of the Royal Navy was summoned to Scapa Flow for what would become his final operation. A man with a lined face and a clipped voice, Finch was known not for brilliance but for brutal reliability. He'd seen action in the Atlantic, escorted civilian liners under Luftwaffe fire, and once hauled 2 sailors out of icy waters with his bare hands. But Vega was different. Vega, he would later write in his brief, unfinished journal, smelled like ghosts before we ever left port. The mission: escort 12 merchant vessels through the Barents Sea, from Lockheed in Scotland to the port of Murmansk. Their cargo, tanks, munitions, fuel, was desperately needed by the Soviets to hold their lines at Leningrad. The route, however, was a corridor of death. German U-boats and long-range bombers stationed in occupied Norway prowled the waters, while weather turned from ice to hell with little warning. Vega departed on March 19, 1942, under moonless skies. The escort team included Finch's own destroyer, HMS Halberd, a light cruiser, and 2 corvettes. Among the merchant ships was a rusted Norwegian freighter, Mjolnir, captained by a man named Erik Nystrom, who spoke little and smiled less. Finch distrusted him immediately, noting in his journal, "His eyes hold storms. He knows more than he says." The first loss came quickly. On the 4th night, a U-boat torpedoed the SS Ludlow, a British cargo ship. The blast split the vessel in half, and within 2 minutes, she vanished beneath the waves. Finch ordered the convoy to tighten formation, though visibility had dropped to 10 meters due to a snow squall. "We're sailing blind, in a graveyard made of ice," one sailor murmured. Radio silence was observed to avoid detection. Messages were relayed by lamp signals and semaphore, a practice that turned lethal in poor weather. On the 7th day, the Mjolnir broke formation and slowed. Finch, observing from the Halberd's bridge, sent 2 flares and a signal. "Why do you drift?" No response came. Hours later, Mjolnir rejoined the convoy without explanation. Her crew offered blank stares. One sailor, interviewed years later, claimed the Norwegian captain received a coded signal from someone not ours. The source of the signal was never confirmed. Then came the fog. Thick as wool, the fog swallowed the sea and sound alike. It rolled in with a wind Finch described as a breath not from God but something older and less merciful. It was during this silence that the HMS Callista, the cruiser in the formation, vanished. No explosion. No flare. Just gone. Searchlights swept the fog. Depth charges were fired blindly. Nothing. Only a single lifeboat was recovered 3 days later, frozen solid with no one aboard. Men began to whisper about betrayal. That someone on the convoy was feeding coordinates to the Kriegsmarine. Suspicion fell again on Mjolnir, whose crew now kept to themselves entirely. A young British signalman reported seeing strange flickers from her deck at night, as if signaling into the void. Finch considered arresting Nystrom but feared a mutiny. By day 11, only 6 merchant ships remained. Then came the worst storm in memory. Waves like walls. Ice crashing from the heavens. A boiler pipe burst on the halberd, killing 3 engineers. The sea howled like an animal in pain, and several crews swore they saw shadows beneath the ice, not whales, but shapes that moved with sentient purpose. One lookout screamed about wolves beneath the sea. He was relieved of duty, but his words stuck. Then, the Mjolnir disappeared. No distress signal. No oil slick. Just gone. Finch wrote in his final journal entry, "I no longer believe this is a convoy. We are not sailing to Murmansk. We are sailing through a test. And the sea does not want us to pass." On March 30th, 3 ships, Halberd SS Calliope, and a Soviet trawler, limped into Murmansk, all badly damaged. Of the original 12, only these survived. No explanation was ever given for the disappearances. No wreckage was found. Nystrom and his crew were never seen again. British Naval Command classified all reports concerning Convoy Vega. Finch returned to England, resigned from the Navy 3 months later, and disappeared to a small cottage in Cornwall. He died in 1963. His journal, found among his belongings, ended with a single line scrawled on the back cover, "The Arctic keeps what it wants." In 1999, a Russian research expedition discovered what they believed to be the remains of the Mjolnir on the ocean floor near Novaya Zemlya, far off the convoy route. There were no bodies, no cargo, and the hull bore unusual scorch marks. The dive team later claimed they were ordered to abandon further exploration. The coordinates were erased from public records. Convoy Vega remains a ghost in official histories, mentioned only in cryptic appendices. Veterans who sailed it either refuse to speak or have taken their stories to the grave. But in pubs along the Scottish coast, old sailors still speak of it in hushed tones. Of ships swallowed by fog. Of howling in the ice. Of betrayal beneath the Union Jack. The sea, they say, remembers. And somewhere in the Arctic night, the wolves of Convoy Vega still hunt. In the cold, clinical heart of Nazi Germany's weapons program, deep within the fortified laboratories of Piemont, worked a man who would quietly alter the course of history, not through bombs or blueprints, but through sabotage disguised as precision. His name was Dr. Maximilian Kessler, a physicist of notable brilliance, who walked among SS officers, dined with rocket engineers, and signed off on plans for terror, all while secretly working to delay the Reich's most catastrophic ambition, the atomic bomb. Born in 1901 in Dusseldorf, Kessler was a quiet boy with a fascination for the invisible, the pull of gravity, the mystery of light, the power of atoms. He earned his doctorate in theoretical physics under Max Born, studied briefly with Einstein before his exile, and was offered a post at Göttingen University. But as the Nazi regime rose, so too did pressure on scientists to serve the state. Kessler's Jewish colleagues vanished one by one. His lectures were reviewed for ideology. And then, in 1938, he was conscripted into the Reich's burgeoning Atomic Research Division. Officially, he was tasked with assisting the Uranverein, the German nuclear weapons project, working under physicist Kurt Diebner. His focus was neutron moderation and fission chain reactions. But in private, Kessler kept a hidden journal and conducted subtle sabotage, changing variables in equations, misreporting uranium purity, and altering coolant measurements in reactor tests. Small changes, seemingly insignificant, but each one a blade in the gears. In his journal, Kessler wrote, "They worship fire, but they do not understand its hunger. They think they are gods, but they build with broken math. I will let them build. But what they build will crumble." He never worked alone. Embedded within the project was a British SOE agent, known only as Jane, whose real name was Margaret Faulkner, a radio technician who posed as a lab assistant. Recruited from Bletchley Park for her fluency in German and background in physics, she managed to intercept and transmit coded information back to London using a hidden transmitter disguised as a voltmeter. She and Kessler communicated through chalkboard corrections and shared glances. They never spoke of what they did. Silence was safer. In the summer of 1943, a major test reactor at Hagerloch failed spectacularly. Official reports blamed faulty design. In truth, Kessler had replaced a critical moderator with a chemically similar compound that stunted fission. The delay cost the project 7 months, months that allowed the Allies to gain momentum in the Pacific and in Europe. Still, suspicion grew. The SS began to tighten control over Piedmont after the British bombing raid known as Operation Hydra. Files were reviewed. Tests rechecked. Kessler found himself questioned by Sicherheitsdienst officers, but his reputation as a meticulous if dull technician shielded him. His genius was hidden under a mask of mediocrity. "The best place to hide the truth," he wrote, "is behind unimpressive eyes." In early 1944, Kessler made his boldest move. Through Jane, he fed detailed diagrams of the V-2 rocket's guidance system and uranium processing timelines to the OSS, prompting a series of targeted Allied bombing raids that destroyed key refineries in Thuringia and Silesia. German leadership grew frantic. Heisenberg himself was called back to Berlin to oversee the reactor progress, while Deibner pushed for mass recruitment of forced laborers to speed the research. Then came a moment Kessler had feared, his reassignment to a uranium enrichment facility near Leipzig. There, security was tighter. Jane would not be with him. The sabotage would be harder. Before leaving, he handed her a folded page from his notebook. On it were incomplete equations, corrected in red ink to reveal a functional reactor core design. At the bottom he wrote, "In wrong hands, this builds a bomb. In yours, it buys us time. Decide wisely." Jane vanished the next day, extracted by OSS under Operation Griffin. Kessler was alone. For 5 months, he continued his work, now surrounded by SS guards and chemists loyal to the regime. He buried his resistance deeper, delaying shipments, corrupting measurement instruments, and feigning health problems to avoid key experiments. His final act of sabotage came in March 1945, when he orchestrated a catastrophic coolant spill that rendered the entire Leipzig facility non-operational. But he would not escape. On April 10, 1945, with Allied forces closing in, Kessler was arrested by the SS for subversive conduct and deliberate obstruction of research. He was executed by firing squad at dawn, buried in an unmarked grave outside a collapsed rail depot. His name was scrubbed from records. His work was credited to others. The nuclear project, in chaos, never achieved its goal. And by August, the Americans had already detonated the world's first atomic bombs, developed by the Manhattan Project, unchallenged by Nazi competition. Decades passed. In 1971, declassified British documents revealed intercepted communications that referenced Prometheus, the code name for an unnamed German informant who had delayed Nazi atomic efforts. Jane, whose identity remained protected until her death in 1992, confirmed Kessler's actions in her memoir Chalk and Fire, calling him the man who broke the bomb from within. In 2003, a memorial plaque was quietly installed at the ruins of Piedmont's reactor testing lab. It bore no name, only an inscription. He gave them equations, but not the answers. May his silence be remembered. To this day, historians debate how close Germany came to building a bomb. But among those who study the narrow margins of history, Maximilian Kessler remains a ghost at the edge of the abyss, a man who played with fire not to wield it, but to keep it from consuming the world. As Berlin crumbled under Soviet shellfire in the final days of April 1945, the city above ground descended into chaos. Children scavenged for bread in gutters, SS squads executed deserters in the streets, and smoke choked the skyline like a funeral shroud. But beneath the broken bones of the Reich's capital, in forgotten subway tunnels and sealed-off maintenance shafts, the war played out on a different front. Here, in the shadowed arteries of the U-Bahn, an underground resistance cell known only as the Iron Bell waged a last, silent war against the dying Nazi regime. Their leader was Friedrich Koenig, a former tram operator and trade unionist whose loyalty to the Weimar Republic had earned him years in a labor camp after Hitler's rise. Freed in 1943 due to a bureaucratic error during a factory labor reorganization, Friedrich vanished into the anonymous crowd of wartime Berliners, middle-aged, gray-bearded, invisible. But he never stopped resisting. Friedrich's knowledge of the city's subterranean systems was unmatched. He knew which tunnels had electrical access, which connected to bunkers, which shafts had been sealed after Allied bombings and which had been secretly reopened by sewer rats, black marketeers, and political ghosts. By the beginning of 1945, he had recruited a network of outcasts, a mute teenage chimney sweep named Lucas, a former Catholic priest stripped of his collar named Otto, a wounded Wehrmacht mechanic named Heinz, and Ruth Weber, a Jewish nurse who had escaped deportation by stealing the identity of a dead Aryan woman. They called themselves Die Eisernen Glock, the Iron Bell, a symbol of defiance that rang out, even if no one could hear it above the surface. Their operations were deliberate, surgical. They rerouted electricity to keep medical caches cold in hidden cellars. They planted forged documents in the rations office to help refugee families disappear. They smuggled food through the tunnel network to Soviet POWs abandoned by the crumbling Gestapo prisons. And when they had to, they killed. One of their most daring acts came on April 21st, when a small group of Hitler Youth cadets took over a bombed-out police precinct in Friedrichstrasse. Armed and radicalized, they executed anyone suspected of defeatist talk. Friedrich's group, after mapping the tunnel vents beneath the station, entered the building through a forgotten coal chute. Lucas, silent and fearless, cut the gas lines. Ruth poured chloroform into ventilation shafts. When the iron bell rose through the trapdoor into the chaos, they moved like ghosts. By dawn, not a single cadet was left alive. Friedrich wept afterward, not from regret, but from the weight of having to murder children to keep other children alive. Their weapon was not ideology, nor vengeance. It was survival, not of themselves, but of decency, of the belief that something human still flickered beneath Berlin's collapsed morality. On April 26, with Soviet tanks less than a mile from the Tiergarten, Friedrich made one last broadcast. From a scavenged Nazi radio in a tunnel beneath Anhalter Bahnhof, he patched into a frequency hijacked from a Volksturm and transmitted a brief, coded message: "The bell tolls now. Protect the hidden. Break the bridges. Smoke the tunnels. The roots are ash, but the seeds are buried." The message was picked up by a Soviet recon team just north of the city. It led them to a hidden Red Army cell imprisoned in an SS interrogation bunker, who were later rescued by forward troops. The Iron Bell's final stand came on April 28. In a tunnel near Potsdamer Platz, they rigged explosives scavenged from an abandoned munitions train to destroy a key junction that Nazi officers were using to flee west. They had 2 hours. Then word came: a group of 23 civilians, mostly women and children, had taken shelter in a nearby utility room after being driven from a burning hospital. If the tunnel collapsed, they would be buried alive. Friedrich made the decision alone. He rerouted the charges, altering the blast radius. The explosion destroyed the Nazi route but left the civilian shelter intact. Heinz was killed in the blast. Otto was buried in debris, dead by the time they dug him out. Friedrich's leg was shattered. Lucas disappeared into the tunnels, never to be seen again. Ruth carried Friedrich on her back for over a mile, through smoke, blood, and silence, until they reached a Soviet patrol near the Brandenburg Gate. When the soldier raised his rifle, Friedrich, barely conscious, whispered one word in broken Russian: "Zvonek," bell. After the war, no record of the Iron Bell was preserved by the Soviet authorities. Berlin's new masters cared little for local resistance unless it came from party-approved partisans. Friedrich was dismissed as a bourgeois dissident. Ruth was arrested in 1946 under suspicion of Zionist agitation and later vanished in the GDR's prison system. The tunnels were sealed, electrified, paved over by the new East Berlin state. But in 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, an amateur historian and urban explorer named Daniel Klee discovered a hidden chamber near Mockenbruck. Inside were ration crates, rusted tools, and a box of forged identity papers, all stamped with a symbol, a bell with a single crack through its face. Along the wall was scrawled a message in chalk, preserved by dry air: "We rang so the city might sleep one more night." Today, There is no official monument for the Iron Bell. Only whispers. In the silent tunnels beneath Berlin, where rats scurry and trains echo like ghosts, some say you can still hear a faint, metallic clang, like a bell struck in mourning, far beneath the feet of the living. The sound of a city's conscience refusing to die. By the spring of 1945, the Empire of Japan stood on the precipice of annihilation. Its fleet shattered, its cities firebombed into ash, and its people starving. The military command clung to one final weapon born not of strategy but of desperation, the kamikaze. Thousands of young men were trained to transform their own deaths into projectiles, to guide aircraft not to return, but to destroy, to become the last breath of a dying empire. Among them was Lieutenant Satoshi Nakamura. He was 21, quiet, and possessed the kind of intellect that had once earned him a scholarship to Kyoto University. Before the war, he had studied literature, he admired Basho, wrote haiku in secret, and played the koto in his mother's garden. But in 1943, conscription ended his studies. By 1945, he was stationed on Kyushu, assigned to the 72nd Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Special Attack Unit. Satoshi arrived at the base in early March. It was a stretch of runway and bunkers carved into a mountainside, overlooking the East China Sea. He was one of the final waves of kamikaze pilots prepared for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the homeland. The mood was reverent, hollow, and strange. Pilots were treated like spirits before they even died. Officers bowed to them. Meals were given with ceremonial quiet. Letters were written in triplicate, sealed in silk. He watched others go. A boy named Takashi, who quoted military slogans and saluted everything, vanished in a trail of smoke over Okinawa. Another, Minoru, wept before boarding but sang until the engine roared. None returned. Their photos were hung in the mess hall, draped in ribbons. "They fly with the emperor," someone would say. Satoshi wrote a final letter each evening. One to his mother, always apologizing. One to his older brother, lost on Saipan. One to no one at all. In one, he confessed, "I feel like a tool that knows it is a tool. They call us flowers, but they want us to burn." On April 5, he was assigned his sortie. A Mitsubishi Zero, loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb beneath its fuselage, was readied. His target, a U.S. aircraft carrier near Okinawa. As dawn rose, he walked across the tarmac in full gear. He bowed to the ground crew, mounted the cockpit, and waited for clearance. But the engine never started. Something in the fuel line had ruptured. Mechanics scrambled, shouting over the wind. Another sortie was launched instead. Satoshi sat there, helmet in his lap, as the sun crept higher and the roar of planes disappeared into the distance. The flight commander approached, said nothing, then simply marked his name back into the rotation. That night, Satoshi could not sleep. He walked the perimeter of the base, past the torii gate painted on the hangar wall, past the paper lanterns hung by the mess hall to guide the spirits of the dead. He looked to the sea, but the moon gave no comfort. In his journal he wrote, "The silence after not dying is louder than any explosion." Over the next 2 weeks, sorties continued. The base thinned. He trained daily, practiced dives, memorized radio codes. But each time his turn came, the mission was delayed, reassigned, or replaced. His plane malfunctioned again, electrical this time. One officer began to whisper that he was cursed. Another, with pity in his voice, asked if he truly wished to die. Satoshi simply bowed. Inside, something was changing. He no longer feared death. He feared the meaninglessness of survival. On April 22, his closest companion on base, Haruki, returned from a mission. He was supposed to be dead. His engine failed shortly after takeoff, forcing a crash landing in the hills. He returned with a broken leg and a shattered expression. In the infirmary, he whispered to Satoshi, "I saw nothing. I saw nothing. There was no glory. Just water and smoke. I wanted to scream. Not for country. For my mother." That night, Satoshi made a decision. He packed his effects into a cloth sack, took only his journal and a photo of his family, and disappeared into the forest behind the base. For 3 days he wandered, half-starved, haunted. On the 4th day, he found a farmer's hut, collapsed from bomb shock. He scavenged for rice and slept beneath broken beams. When American forces landed in Kyushu months later, they never found Satoshi. He had taken refuge with a retired monk who lived alone in the mountains. The man, once a scholar himself, said nothing when Satoshi arrived, only poured tea and offered silence. Satoshi stayed with him for 5 years. He never spoke of the war. In 1951, a former Kamikaze officer recognized Satoshi in a market in Kagoshima. The encounter was brief, tense. That night, Satoshi packed his bag and vanished again. His journal, however, resurfaced in 1984. Discovered in a monastery archive in Nagano Prefecture, it had been donated anonymously. Inside were hundreds of pages, carefully written, poetry, reflections, and the full account of his time as a kamikaze who never dove. The final entry read, "I was taught to die with honor. I chose to live with shame. But the shame was not mine. It belonged to those who could only see honor in ash." Today, Satoshi Nakamura's name does not appear in any official military records. No shrine bears his photograph. But in the quiet halls of the Kyoto Peace Museum, his journal rests beneath glass. Visitors read his words and see the face of a man who chose to walk away from the altar of death. A man who understood that survival, in the end, is not cowardice, but defiance. In the Empire's final days, he was its shadow, an echo of doubt, flickering behind the rising sun. You've heard it now, the echo of resistance that history tried to bury. A man who sabotaged silence with equations, a bell that rang below dying cities, a pilot who lived when death was expected. These aren't myths. They're warnings. And they remind us, the most dangerous truths are the ones whispered beneath the noise of war, hidden, waiting, watching, until someone opens the box again. Just like you did.